Hey Monster Hunters, if you're enjoying Beast and Bible, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and don't forget to share it with somebody who might like it. Now, on to the show.
Oh, no it hasn't! It's a house! Come on, Gretel! It's a house made of candy! Oh, thank you, we're saved! Gretel, we're saved! I'm gonna have a piece of that roof. And you have some of that candy window. Go on, Greta, it's lovely. But who do you think it is? What does it matter? It's food. At last we'll have a fine meal. Is it sweet? It's delicious.
Nibble, nibble, little mouse. Who is eating at my house?
Liquor? Yes.
Now I've got them. I shall eat them with as much relish as they are eating my house.
That clip was the first witch I remember encountering. She was played by Joan Collins and appeared on a show called Children's Fairy Tale Theater, hosted by Shelley Duvall, known for her work on Stephen King's The Shining. The weekly series featured major stars lending their talents to retellings of children's stories by Hans Christian Andersen and the Brothers Grimm, the story of Hansel and Gretel being one of my favorites. Something about the figure of the witch is both terrifying and fascinating, and not just in children's tales, novels, or films like The Wizard of Oz. They instill a great deal of unease in Christians, even when they appear in the pages of Scripture. Today, we will travel to Endor. No, not the forest moon of Endor from Star Wars: Return of the Jedi, but the village of Endor, from which, according to my brief research, provided the namesake for George Lucas's moon that housed the teddy bear-like Ewoks. The village of Endor appears in the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel 28 to be exact, where, instead of teddy bear-like Ewoks, we come upon a witch who appears to have the power to raise prophets from the dead. What's more, biblical scholars have tried to come up with a variety of explanations for this narrative, since necromancy, talking to the dead, is expressly prohibited in the Bible. Why would the spirit of a prophet cooperate with a witch to deliver a message? For example, in its commentary on this passage, the Apologetic Study Bible makes some comments regarding whether or not the witch raised Samuel from the dead. Here's what it says, quote, "Though scholars disagree on the question, the Bible suggests that she did. The law of Moses sternly forbids consultation of mediums, but never says that communicating with the dead is impossible. Saul was seemingly able to speak with a figure that not only accurately repeated key themes from Samuel's personal private conversations with Saul, but also correctly predicted the deaths of Saul and his sons. This suggests that the king was indeed speaking with Samuel," end quote. The commentary continues by asking if everyone goes to the same place at death, and then states, quote, "This verse refers to an intermediate state between physical death and one's final destiny. Samuel had only recently died," end quote. The commentary in the Apologetic Study Bible even goes so far as to suggest Ecclesiastes 3:20-21 and Deuteronomy 12:2 and 3 to support this conclusion. But Ecclesiastes only speaks of not knowing what happens after death, in keeping with the life is a vapor theme of the whole book, and Daniel talks of the resurrection at Christ's return. Neither of these verses speak to an intermediate state of death, reminding us that just because you attach a Bible text to something doesn't mean it applies. Scholars working in traditions like the Seventh-day Adventist Church believe that the soul isn't immortal and waits for immortality at the second coming and resurrection. This means that when people die, they know nothing. They can't speak to anyone. So who, or what, did the witch bring back from the grave if it wasn't Samuel? Speculations about this spectral narrative abound. I've heard people speculate that there is an intermediate state after death, like we just talked about, akin to a type of purgatory where the dead may still be reached before their final destination, and I have heard that the witch summoned a demon, not Samuel. Yet, if that's true, the demon's message seems to be rooted in truth, which is also problematic. To help us wrangle this witchy tale, I've invited Dr. Laurence Turner, theology professor emeritus from Newbold College in England, to the podcast. I'm calling this episode, Which Way Did She Go? I'm Dr. Seth Pierce, and welcome to Beast and Bible. thank you so much, Dr. Turner, for being with us on Beast and Bible today.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking me. I'm looking forward to the time we have together.
So briefly, what is the background of the witch story in 1 Samuel 28?
Well, the background to this episode where King Saul goes to see the medium at Endor, and that's usually the term that's used these days to describe her. She's a medium or a necromancer rather than a witch and the kind of associations we might have with that. The background to it is that the Philistines have assembled their army and they are once again going to engage Israel in battle. The problems with the Philistines have been going on forever with Israel. And it was this problem that brought Saul to the throne. They wanted a king who could solve the Philistine problem for them. But we're now coming towards the end of Saul's reign, and his relationship with God has been in a downward spiral. He's already heard that God has rejected him from being king. Things are going from bad to worse. And then at the beginning of this story, we're told something which just seems like a giveaway to begin with. And it simply says that Saul had expelled all of the mediums from Israel. And it seems just like a bit of a random bit of information. But the significance of that becomes clear in just a little while. So Saul is facing battle and he is afraid of the Philistines, not for the first time. So he inquires of God, what should I do? But God doesn't answer him, not by any of the normal means, not by dreams, not by prophets, not by Urim and Thummim, nothing of that nature. So then Saul says, find me a medium. I want to talk to a medium. So his motivation for going to the medium is that he's got rid of the mediums, or at least so he thinks. But he hasn't done a very good job, because no sooner as he said, find me a medium, than his servants say, oh, there's one at Endor, let's go there. So that's the immediate background, the motivation for him seeking out a medium, although at that stage, we still don't know precisely why he wants to go and see a medium.
So he goes and he visits this medium, and what happens in their exchange?
Well, that's a good question. What exactly is it that happens? On the surface of the story, it seems that what does happen is he goes, and she's a bit nervous because she doesn't recognize him. He's disguised himself. And she says, don't you know that Saul has got rid of all the mediums? I'm putting my life at risk of you coming here. And he says, what I want you to do is call up Samuel. And we thought, well, all the people for Saul to call up is Samuel,
Right.
Because Samuel has given him a hard time over the years. So clearly what he wants to do is God won't speak to him. So we'll get a prophet who will speak to him and tell him what to do. That seems to be the motivation.
So I've read this several times, and when I was in my theology program in the undergrad and doing my Master of Divinity in seminary, this would come up all the time, and there's all kinds of speculation as to what happens, because just as a surface sort of plain reading of the narrative, it appears that she successfully conjures up the ghost of Samuel. And this has led to all kinds of debates and all kinds of discussion, the implications of that. So from your perspective and your experience, how have Christian scholars sought to explain this passage, especially given the stark warnings against necromancy in the Hebrew Scriptures?
Okay, yes. Well, this has been a real problem over the centuries. It's one of, if not the most seemingly intractable problems in the interpretation of the Old Testament. But basically, in the history of interpretation, there have been three approaches to the story. Some say that the medium, by her own power and by her own skills, genuinely raised Samuel from the dead. And some people might say, well, how is that possible, in light of what you've just said, the warnings against it. And these people would say, well, in the Old Testament, they would say, communication with the dead is possible. It is possible, but it's simply prohibited for Israel. It's not that it can't be done, but don't do it.
Yeah, I've actually read some commentaries that have talked about that. It's interesting. There's several commentaries, and it's sort of the line, it doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means you shouldn't do it.
That's
And
correct, yeah.
I'm thinking of like, just knowing how I don't want to caricature or stereotype teenagers or adolescents, but thinking like, it's sort of like it works, just don't do it. I mean, it doesn't seem like a really great, responsible thing to say because then you've got that seed of curiosity, like, well, maybe get desperate enough, maybe like King Saul, maybe I should give this a try. So it seems to me that opens up, practically speaking, a lot of problems.
Exactly, yes, and that's one reason why that hasn't been the major point of view on this. So that's one approach. Another approach is to say, it wasn't the medium who called up Samuel; it was actually God Himself. God can raise the dead. So on this one occasion, uniquely to prove one particular point, God did a special work by raising Samuel from the dead.
Yeah, and that also opens up a series of issues too, because and we'll talk about this in a little bit. But many traditions have very distinct and very passionate beliefs about what happens after you die, including Seventh-day Adventist Christians, among others. And so to suggest that God is willing to bend the rules on something that He prohibits, and something that God prohibits pretty starkly in the Hebrew Scriptures, like don't suffer any of these people to live. There's like a death penalty that goes along with finding a medium or a necromancer, and then you see God. But for me, it's okay, and it seems to create a lot of issues.
Yeah, so we've got problems with number one, it's the medium who does it. Number two, God who does it. Now, the third approach, and this is the one which historically is by far the most predominant of approaches and agreed by more people than any other, is that it wasn't the medium who did it, and it wasn't God who did it, but the raising of Samuel was a satanic deception, because it has to be a satanic deception because this sort of thing is prohibited elsewhere. So if it happened, it must be wrong, and if it's wrong, it must be Satan. So that's, I'd say, where the majority in the history of interpretation land.
I've seen some variation on the second one with God doing this, and one of the speculations is, even though it was a Protestant commentary, and I've seen this in Protestant study Bibles, they sort of make a space for purgatory. There's this liminal space that souls can kind of hang out in. I don't know if you've heard of that before, but it's, in their attempts to try to explain where souls might be, they almost put forth a liminal space or several tiers of the afterlife in different states. I don't know. Have you heard of that at all?
Yes, I think that's sometimes based on one or two passages in the Old Testament, and these are sort of poetic passages. And so the difficulty is, to what extent do we take this just as it comes, and to what extent is it we've got to take into account the poetic idiom, but the idea somehow of after death sort of shades existing in Sheol and so on. Should we take those as they come, or not? So that point of view would be attempting to say, well, there's maybe a glimmer of that in these Hebrew texts. And another reason for it is, if you look around Israel, the cultures that surround it, places like Egypt and so on had very well developed sense of life beyond death, and the pharaohs being mummified, and going on their journey. So you see all of that around Israel. Therefore, if it was around Israel, it was likely in Israel as well. That's making a few assumptions, though, that that no culture can be unique on anything like this.
Sure. So going back to the third point, it's a satanic deception, and that's the one I grew up with, and as you said, is kind of the most popular. I think one of the challenging things that goes with that is it appears that Samuel, in quotes now, Samuel still tells the truth, to Saul. And so even though it's a deception, there appears to be a pronouncement of judgment that still seems in line with what God said, which is confusing. So if it's a deception, would Samuel, again in quotes, tell the truth, or would it simply be, in this interpretation, the devil is just reveling in Saul's destruction?
Yeah, well, you put your finger on an issue there about what the assumed Samuel says. Is he telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, or is it a little bit more complicated than that? I think it's a little bit more. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. that's one of the things that's, I'd like to sort of unpack a little bit in a minute. But in line with what you've just been saying, about that satanic deception approach and so on, that's the way not only, that the majority have looked at the narrative and somewhat sort of sidestepped the point that you've just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also the common one in Adventist approaches as well. And I think this might help to if I sort of try to put this in context, to give a kind of foundation for exploring some of the things you've just said.
Mm-hmm.
But the typical Adventist approach, I think, and the one which, but tell me if I'm wrong on this, but the usual approach we hear is, well, the medium of Endor, she's in league with Satan. It couldn't have been Samuel who was raised from the dead. It couldn't have been Samuel who was raised from the dead. That's impossible. Why is it impossible? Well, one of our fundamental beliefs, the state of the dead, tells us that the dead know nothing. So it couldn't be Samuel raised from the dead. So if Samuel isn't raised from the dead, what must it be then? Well, it's a satanic deception. Okay.
Yeah.
And much of this is also, I think, just asserting what Ellen White asserts as well. She says the same thing. Now, there is a problem with that. Not so much a problem. The greatest problem is not the conclusion that might be arrived at, but the method at which we get there, because that approach takes very little time actually reading the narrative itself. They don't say, okay, we've got a narrative here, let's read it and see the details. So we don't read the narrative. We don't read the context in which it's found. This is found in the book of 1 Samuel. And what is the narrative strategy of the books of Samuel? What do we find in the books of Samuel in the larger context that might help us to understand what's going on in this chapter, which is 1 Samuel chapter 28? But rather we tend to say, look, A, the narrative seems to say this, but B, that is impossible, so it must be C, a satanic delusion. But very little interpretation of the narrative itself gets done.
Yes. No, I find that to be true as well. And one of the questions that we had talked about earlier, and I had kind of gone over with you, is how Seventh-day Adventists, and others, we believe the soul is not inherently immortal, and we have this special challenge in explaining the text. Just like you said, we believe when you die, that's it. There's no life until the resurrection. But Adventists have to grapple with this text, and often they'll write it off as a satanic deception and not grapple with the text. But for those who approach the text, what are some common ways you have heard? One that comes to mind that I've heard is when you read the text, it says, Samuel was kind of brought up from the ground. And so if this was really Samuel in heaven, he would be coming down, not up from the ground. And so those are some of the ways I've heard Adventists grapple with the text. What do you think of that, or what have you heard?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that one too. And when I was younger, I found it quite convincing. But I don't think we can call that really a convincing, is it up or is it down? There's no concept in the Old Testament and of anybody. Well, I said there's no concept. I mean, you've got Elijah who's taken up,
Yeah.
to heaven. But in general, that isn't what happens. So the coming up is a way of saying this person is being raised from the dead, or being raised from wherever the dead go. But the sense of at death your immortal soul or whatever goes to heaven is alien to the Old Testament. I mean, the argument is okay as far as it goes, but it's not really the clincher, that some people might think of.
Right. So this brings me to something I'm so excited for you to share with our listeners. I heard you talk about this on another Sabbath school presentation. You have a unique way of approaching this story. Would you share with us how you have approached the story of the witch or the medium of Endor?
Okay, well, one of my main interests is in biblical narrative, particularly Old Testament narrative. So I've got an interest in the way in which biblical narrative works. And biblical narrative works according to conventions of its own rather than conventions of 21st century Western literature. And so one of the mistakes we make often, I think, is that we apply to this ancient Hebrew text the same conventions that we use when we are writing or reading modern stories, and wonder why it doesn't work. So where I begin is from the observation that 1 Samuel, which is where we find this narrative, 1 Samuel is a narrative book. So what narrative strategies does the book use elsewhere in the book, and specifically in chapter 28, where this story occurs? So I sort of work through a number of steps, about 5 or 6 steps in getting to a conclusion. Now, the first step, and this is sort of a foundational perspective that I bring to doing the interpretation, is that 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel as well for that matter, persistently sets up parallels between episodes in the larger narrative. So time and time again, we'll read one narrative, got to say narrative A. We move on a bit and we come to another narrative, narrative B. And when we're reading narrative B, we say, my word, narrative B. That reminds me for all the world like narrative A. There's this point of contact, that point of contact. And what we find is that when you get to narrative B, you find that these 2 episodes are then in dialogue. One helps to interpret the other and give insight into the other. And it doesn't just happen once or twice. I read a scholar recently who talked about this approach, and he calls it obsessive within the books of Samuel. And it's part of the overall strategy. So that, for me, that's an important element to take into account. That, well, first of all, we should read 1 Samuel 28, but we should also be reading it in the context of other similar episodes. And that's a key element in understanding it, I think. Let me give one example of where this happens elsewhere, just briefly. And everybody knows the story of David and Goliath, and not quite so well known possibly, but fairly well known is how King Saul dies. Now, if you've already read the story of David and Goliath, and then you come to the story of King Saul's death, all of a sudden a mass of parallels are arraigned before you. So, for example, we know that Saul is the tallest Israelite. He was head and shoulders above everybody else. So Saul is the tallest Israelite. Goliath was the tallest Philistine. So only 2 characters in the books of Samuel, only of 2 characters are we given their height. And one is Saul, and the other is Goliath, right? When Saul's on the battlefield facing death, he refers to the Philistines as these uncircumcised men. That is not a compliment, all right?
No.
And David, when he faces Goliath, calls Goliath this uncircumcised Philistine. Again, not a compliment.
Yeah.
Saul is killed by his own sword. He falls on his own sword. Goliath is killed by his own sword. David takes the sword out and dispatches him. Saul was beheaded on the battlefield. Goliath was beheaded on the battlefield. Saul was stripped of his armor. Goliath was stripped of his armor. Saul's armor on the battlefield is taken and it's put into a Philistine sanctuary. And Goliath's sword is taken from him and kept in an Israelite sanctuary at Nob.
Parallels. Yeah.
Oh, goodness me. Why, in talking about the death of Saul, are we reminded repeatedly about the death of Goliath? And my take on it is that the narrator depicts the fate of Saul in terms that recall the defeat of the Philistine champion Goliath, because it underlines graphically the failure of Saul. Saul was the one originally intended to save his people from the Philistines, but he meets his end defeated by the Philistines in a way that recalls how David defeated the Philistine champion Goliath, and that happens to King Saul himself. So Saul's death exemplifies the failure of his life and of his kingship. Okay, now of course that isn't stated explicitly. The narrative isn't saying, "Dear reader, look back to the previous episode." But if you got your wits about you, you cannot miss those kinds of parallels.
Yes.
And one other, I'll just mention this in passing, but two other episodes, 1 Samuel chapter 24 and 26. If you read chapters 24, read chapter 24, then read chapter 26. Chapter 24 begins with Saul and 3,000 men pursuing David. Chapter 26 begins with Saul and 3,000 men pursuing David. And chapter 26 essentially repeats all of the essential elements of chapter 24. So having a later episode that recalls an earlier episode, and this happening time and time again in Samuel, should alert us that when we're trying to understand one narrative, another narrative might very well give us light to help us understand this one, especially if there's something awkward or difficult in it, as there is with the story of the witch or medium of Endor.
Yes.
So that brings me to the critical connection. All right. Mm-hmm. Chapter 28 is the story of the medium of Endor, and what I suggest is that we read that chapter 28 in partnership with 1 Samuel chapter 25, which is the story of Nabal and his wife, Abigail, and David. And to give a looking forward a bit, what I argue is that the roles of Abigail in chapter 25 and the role of the medium in chapter 28 are intended to be read together, so we see comparisons and contrasts, and that gives us insight into what's going on in chapter 28.
That's fascinating. So, yeah, this is a huge thing, I think, for many of our listeners, getting these sort of interpretive keys and clues, which can help release some of the tension and even frustration, trying to understand these strange, awkward stories. So as you compare these two, Abigail and the medium of Endor, what have you discovered about the passage?
Okay, if you first of all look at the passage as a whole before we come to the individuals, the narrative in chapter 25, the one which is about David and Abigail, it begins, "Now Samuel died, and all Israel mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah." The story in chapter 28 begins, "Now Samuel died." Now, come on, how many times does Samuel die?
Right.
So this is a way of saying, look, we're setting in motion two narratives that need to be read together, and they each have in the Hebrew, it's virtually identical introductions. Now Samuel died. Now Samuel died. Chapter 25, David is fearful. He's fearful of Saul. Chapter 28, Saul is fearful. He's fearful of the Philistines. 25, David goes on a journey out into the wilderness. 28, Saul goes on a journey to Endor. 25, David meets a significant woman, Abigail. 28, Saul meets a significant woman, the medium. 25, David receives a message about his present and his future. 28, Saul receives a message about his present and his future. So that confirms my probe that these two chapters deserve to be read together. Now, I've only given you a few there. There are many others, linguistic ones where the Hebrew is the same, and also thematic connections, which also bring these two chapters together, which I could I mean, for example, one other connection in 25, David makes a request of Nabal, but Nabal refuses. In 28, Saul makes a request of God, but God refuses. So, there are 10, 12 or more other.
It's just very clear and stark.
Well, it isn't that, this narrative uses the word therefore, and this narrative uses the word therefore.
Right.
It's not, of details that are of no consequence. But
it's major details.
Yeah, details which move the plot forward, congregate in each of these episodes.
It reminds me a little bit when I've done looking at different pieces of literature and looking at the intertextuality and how they draw on each other. And kind of a classic example from contemporary popular culture is you look at the Harry Potter narrative and you've got giant spiders who live in the woods, written by an English author. And you're like, where else have we seen the English author put giant spiders in the woods? It's, you have Tolkien, and so it's very, clear that one is drawing on the other. It's right there. And they're both significant plot points. It's, again, like you said, it's not, using a therefore or a however. It's major characters and scenes. Or even, the platform 9 3/4 magically walking through a wall and ending up in a magic world. You've got C.S. Lewis, you walk through a wardrobe and you end up in Narnia. And so they're very clear parallels. So it's kind of a similar idea when you're looking at these two chapters, very significant details and parallels that, signal that maybe these two should go together.
That's right. And seeing them enriches your reading, because you get all of these associations coming together, which you don't get if you're just reading it, on a flat surface.
As for you, my fine lady, it's true, I can't attend you here and now as I'd like, but just try to stay out of my way. Just try. I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too.
I realize you might be experiencing the same level of anger that the Wicked Witch of the West did, knowing that I am ending the first half of our discussion here. Still, between now and the concluding segment on the Witch of Endor, you have time to go through 1 Samuel 25 and see how Abigail compares and contrasts with the witch in 1 Samuel 28. What do you notice between these two women that might give clues to unraveling the mystery of Saul and the witch? Take some notes, ruminate on them, and join us next time for part 2 of Which Way Did She Go? Thank you for listening to Beast and Bible.
Beast and Bible is written, researched, produced, and hosted by Dr. Seth Pierce. Ethan Geck is our editor. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Equipment and tech help from the dynamic duo James Gigante and Stephen Husett. Producing and project help from me, Heather Moore. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible. Tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a nightlight on after dark.